Sarah Matthews had built her tech empire from nothing, turning a simple app idea into a billion-dollar company that employed thousands across America. Her corner office on the 47th floor of downtown Seattle offered breathtaking views of Elliott Bay, and her calendar was packed with board meetings, investor calls, and product launches. But none of that mattered now as she sat in the pediatric neurologist's office, holding her 5-year-old son Ethan's small hand while the doctor delivered words that would change everything. Ethan had never spoken a single word. Born perfectly healthy, with bright hazel eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the world around him, Ethan had developed normally in every way except one. He walked at 11 months, solved complex puzzles meant for children twice his age, and could read basic words by age 3. But his voice remained silent, locked away behind an invisible barrier that no amount of money, specialists, or cutting-edge treatment seemed able to break through. The doctor explained selective mutism with the same clinical detachment that Sarah used in her business presentations, but the words felt like daggers. Psychological trauma, anxiety disorders, communication barriers that might never be overcome. Sarah listened while fighting back tears, her CEO composure crumbling as she watched Ethan quietly arrange toy blocks into perfect geometric patterns, seemingly unaware of the conversation that would define his future. That evening, Sarah sat in her minimalist penthouse apartment overlooking the city lights, watching Ethan draw elaborate pictures of spaceships and dragons. His artwork was extraordinary for a child his age, filled with intricate details and vibrant colors that seemed to tell stories his voice couldn't share. She had tried everything from speech therapy to art therapy, from meditation retreats to experimental treatments at Johns Hopkins. Nothing worked. The worst part wasn't the silence itself, but the looks of pity from other parents at school events, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, and the growing distance between herself and the son she loved more than life itself. How could she run a company that connected millions of people worldwide when she couldn't connect with her own child? Sarah's marriage had ended 2 years earlier when her husband David couldn't handle the stress and uncertainty of Ethan's condition. He had wanted to institutionalize their son, claiming it would be better for everyone. The divorce was swift and brutal, leaving Sarah as a single mother juggling corporate responsibilities with the overwhelming challenges of raising a special needs child. Most mornings began the same way. Sarah would wake up at 5 a.m., review quarterly reports while drinking her coffee, then gently wake Ethan for school. She had hired the best nannies money could buy, but none of them understood Ethan the way she did. He communicated through gestures, drawings, and expressive eyes that somehow conveyed more emotion than most people managed with 1,000 words. 3 months after that devastating doctor's appointment, Sarah made a decision that shocked her board of directors and sent ripples through the tech industry. She stepped down as CEO, appointing her trusted COO Marcus Johnson to take over daily operations while she remained as chairman. The headlines were brutal, speculating about hostile takeovers, health issues, and corporate scandals. But Sarah didn't care what the business world thought anymore. She had decided to dedicate herself completely to Ethan. The transition wasn't easy. Sarah had built her identity around being a successful businesswoman, the first female CEO in her industry to reach billionaire status before age 35. Suddenly finding herself with unlimited time felt strange and disorienting. But watching Ethan's face light up when she picked him up from school instead of the nanny made every sacrifice worthwhile. They established new routines together. Morning walks in Discovery Park where Ethan would point excitedly at squirrels and birds, afternoon art sessions where his creativity flourished, and evening reading time where Sarah would voice all the characters in elaborate stories while Ethan followed along with rapt attention. These moments were precious, but the silence between them remained an invisible wall. One particularly difficult Tuesday in November, everything seemed to go wrong. Ethan had what his therapist called a meltdown at school, throwing toys and hiding under his desk when the class was too loud. Sarah received the call during a crucial board meeting and rushed to pick him up, her heart breaking as she found him curled up in the nurse's office, tears streaming down his red cheeks. The pediatric therapist suggested they try something different. Instead of focusing on speech therapy in clinical settings, perhaps Ethan needed more natural social interactions with other children. She recommended Maple Grove Community Center, a small neighborhood facility that offered inclusive play programs for children of all abilities. Sarah was hesitant. Her son had always struggled in group settings, often becoming overwhelmed by noise and chaos. But desperate for any breakthrough, she decided to give it a try. Maple Grove Community Center was nothing like the upscale facilities they usually visited. Located in a working-class neighborhood south of downtown, the building was older and modest, with scuffed linoleum floors and hand-painted murals created by local kids. The playground equipment looked well-used but lovingly maintained, and the atmosphere felt warm and welcoming in a way that expensive therapy centers never quite managed. On their first visit, Sarah felt out of place in her designer clothes among parents wearing work uniforms and casual attire. But the program coordinator, Mrs. Rodriguez, welcomed them with genuine warmth that put both Sarah and Ethan at ease. She had been working with special needs children for over 20 years and had an intuitive understanding of how to create safe spaces for kids who struggled with traditional communication. Ethan gravitated toward the art corner, where he began working on an elaborate chalk drawing of a castle surrounded by friendly dragons. Other children drifted over, curious about his artwork, and while Ethan didn't speak, he began sharing his chalk with them and pointing to different parts of his drawing. It was more social interaction than Sarah had seen from him in months. As weeks passed, their visits to Maple Grove became the highlight of both their schedules. Sarah found herself making friends with other parents, many of whom were dealing with their own challenges. Maria, a nurse whose daughter had autism, shared strategies for dealing with sensory overload. James, a mechanic whose son had cerebral palsy, offered insights about adaptive equipment and inclusive activities. These conversations opened Sarah's eyes to a world she had never experienced despite her wealth and success. These parents faced the same daily struggles she did, but without the financial resources to hire specialists or try experimental treatments. Yet their children seemed happier and more integrated than Ethan had ever been in his expensive private programs. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday afternoon in December. Sarah was sitting on a bench watching Ethan play with Lincoln logs when she noticed a commotion near the sandbox. A little girl named Amy, who had Down syndrome, was crying because some older kids had knocked down the elaborate sand castle she had spent an hour building. The other children seemed uncertain about how to help, and Amy's distress was growing. Without thinking, Sarah stood up to intervene, but stopped when she saw what happened next. A man in paint-splattered work clothes knelt down next to Amy with infinite gentleness. Sarah recognized him as Jake Morrison, a single father who brought his 6-year-old daughter Lucy to the program every week. Jake worked construction and always arrived straight from job sites, his hands still dirty from honest labor. Sarah had exchanged polite nods with him but had never really talked to any of the other parents beyond surface-level pleasantries. Jake's voice was soft but clear as he spoke to Amy. "You know what, sweetheart? I bet we can build an even more amazing castle than the one that got knocked down. Sometimes when something gets broken, we get a chance to make it even better than before." He began helping Amy rebuild her sand castle, but this time he invited other children to join. Lucy brought over small plastic figures to populate the castle. A boy named Marcus contributed shells he had found during a family beach trip. Soon, half a dozen children were working together, creating something far more elaborate and beautiful than Amy's original creation. Sarah watched, transfixed, as Jake naturally facilitated cooperation between children who had never played together before. He asked questions that drew out their creativity, praised their contributions, and somehow made each child feel essential to the project. But what struck Sarah most was how he treated every child exactly the same, whether they had disabilities or not. Then Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip. Ethan had abandoned his Lincoln logs and was walking slowly toward the sandbox. He had never approached a group activity voluntarily, preferring to play alone or with Sarah nearby. But something about Jake's gentle leadership and the collaborative atmosphere drew him in. Jake noticed Ethan's approach and smiled warmly. "Hey there, buddy. We're building the most amazing sand castle in the world. Want to help us make it even more awesome? Ethan nodded and knelt down next to the sandbox. Jake handed him a small shovel and showed him how to create defensive walls around the castle. Soon, Ethan was working intently, adding his own creative touches to the structure. The other children welcomed him naturally, showing him their favorite building techniques and admiring his careful attention to detail. For 45 minutes, Sarah watched her son engage with other children in ways she had never seen before. He was still silent, but he was communicating through gestures, expressions, and shared creativity. When it was time to leave, Ethan looked genuinely disappointed, pointing back toward the sandbox and then to Jake. That night, Sarah found herself thinking about Jake Morrison. She had made assumptions about him based on his work clothes and blue-collar background, but watching him with the children revealed a level of emotional intelligence and natural teaching ability that rivaled any child development specialist she had ever hired. His daughter Lucy clearly adored him, and the other children gravitated toward his calm, accepting presence. Over the following weeks, Sarah began paying more attention to Jake and his interactions with the children. She learned that he was a widower who had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier. Despite working demanding construction jobs to support himself and Lucy, he never missed the community center programs. He had an intuitive understanding of how to create inclusive environments where every child felt valued and accepted. Sarah also noticed that Jake treated her differently than most people did. He didn't know about her corporate background or financial success, and she had never mentioned it. To him, she was simply another parent trying to help her child navigate the world. Their conversations were refreshingly normal, focused on their kids' progress and the small victories that meant everything to parents like them. One afternoon in January, Sarah arrived at the community center to find Ethan already engaged in the group building project. Jake had brought materials to construct a miniature city out of cardboard boxes and art supplies. Each child was responsible for creating one building, and together they would design the layout of their imaginary town. Ethan had chosen to build a library, carefully cutting out tiny windows and painting detailed bookshelves on the interior walls. Sarah watched as Jake knelt down next to her son, examining the intricate work with genuine admiration. "This is incredible craftsmanship, Ethan. I can tell you put a lot of thought into every single detail. What do you think should go next to the library in our town?" Ethan pointed to Lucy's courthouse and then to Amy's ice cream shop, indicating that he thought the library should be positioned between them. Jake nodded seriously, as if Ethan had spoken the most profound urban planning insight ever conceived. "You're absolutely right. People need to be able to easily access both justice and ice cream after they finish reading. That's brilliant city planning." The other children laughed at Jake's joke, and Sarah noticed something extraordinary. Ethan was smiling, truly smiling, in a way she hadn't seen in months. More than that, he seemed to be trying to communicate something to Jake, his mouth opening and closing as if he was struggling to form words. Jake noticed too, but he didn't make a big deal of it. Instead, he continued the conversation naturally, responding to Ethan's gestures and expressions as if they were having a perfectly normal dialogue. His acceptance and patience created a safe space where Ethan felt no pressure to perform or meet expectations. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah found herself drawn into conversations with the other parents. Maria shared funny stories about her daughter's latest obsessions. James offered to help Sarah understand some of the adaptive equipment options she had been researching. These relationships, built around shared experiences rather than professional networking, felt more genuine than any she had formed in the corporate world. When the session ended, Jake approached Sarah while the children were cleaning up their supplies. He had never initiated a personal conversation before, and Sarah felt unexpectedly nervous. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but Ethan has made incredible progress over the past few months. When he first started coming here, he seemed almost invisible, like he was trying not to take up any space. Now look at him." Sarah followed Jake's gaze to where Ethan was carefully helping Amy organize the art supplies, showing her how to sort the markers by color. The interaction was quiet but unmistakably caring. "I don't know what you've been doing differently, but whatever it is, it's working." Ethan is starting to believe that his voice matters, even when he's not using words. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on specialists and treatments, but this man in paint-stained work clothes had identified something fundamental that all the experts had missed. Ethan didn't need to be fixed or cured. He needed to feel valued and accepted exactly as he was. That evening, Sarah sat with Ethan during their usual reading time, but instead of choosing one of their familiar stories, she pulled out a photo album from their recent visits to the community center. As they looked through pictures of Ethan working on various projects, playing with other children, and interacting with Jake, Sarah began talking about how proud she was of his kindness and creativity. "You know what I've learned from watching you, sweetheart? Sometimes the most important things we say don't come from our voices. They come from our hearts. And your heart speaks louder than anyone I know." Ethan looked at her with those expressive hazel eyes, and Sarah could swear she saw understanding there. He pointed to a picture of himself helping Amy with her sand castle, then pointed to his own heart. The following week brought an unexpected challenge. Jake didn't show up to the community center, and Lucy arrived with her grandmother, looking worried and upset. Sarah learned that Jake had been injured in a construction accident and was in the hospital with a broken leg and concussion. The doctors said he would be fine, but he would need several weeks of recovery. The absence of Jake's steady presence affected all the children, but Ethan seemed particularly unsettled. He kept looking toward the entrance as if expecting Jake to walk in at any moment. When it became clear that Jake wasn't coming, Ethan withdrew to his usual corner, abandoning the group activities he had been enjoying. Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She asked Mrs. Rodriguez if she could take over Jake's role in facilitating the group activities until he recovered. She had no experience with child development programs, but she had been watching Jake's techniques for months and was determined to maintain the supportive environment he had created. Her first attempts were awkward. Sarah was used to commanding boardrooms full of executives, but engaging a group of children required completely different skills. She tried to replicate Jake's gentle humor and inclusive approach, but her corporate background kept slipping through in subtle ways. The breakthrough came when she stopped trying to be Jake and started being herself. Instead of attempting to recreate his construction-themed activities, Sarah drew on her own background to introduce problem-solving games and creative challenges. She brought in basic coding concepts adapted for young children, showing them how to create simple algorithms using colored blocks and movement patterns. To her amazement, the children responded enthusiastically. Even more surprisingly, Ethan began taking on a leadership role, helping other children understand the logical sequences and celebrating their successes with high fives and encouraging nods. After 2 weeks of running the program, Sarah realized she had learned more about communication and leadership from these children than from years of business school and corporate training. These kids taught her that real connection happens when you meet people where they are, not where you think they should be. Jake returned to the community center on a Thursday afternoon in February, walking with a slight limp but smiling broadly as the children rushed to welcome him back. Lucy threw herself into his arms while the other kids crowded around to see his cast and hear stories about his hospital stay. But the most touching reunion was between Jake and Ethan. Sarah's son approached Jake slowly, carrying a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a hand-drawn picture showing Jake working on the sand castle with all the children gathered around him. At the bottom, in Ethan's careful handwriting, were the words "Thank you for seeing me." Jake's eyes filled with tears as he knelt down to Ethan's level. "This is the most beautiful gift I've ever received, buddy. And you want to know something? I see you every single day, and what I see is pretty amazing." What happened next would be burned into Sarah's memory forever. Ethan looked directly into Jake's eyes, took a deep breath, and spoke his first words. "Thank you for helping me find my voice." The words were quiet, slightly hoarse from years of disuse, but they were clear and unmistakable. The entire room fell silent as every parent and child processed what they had just witnessed. Sarah felt her knees buckle as tears streamed down her face. Mrs. Rodriguez grabbed a nearby chair to steady herself. Even the other children seemed to understand the magnitude of the moment. Jake didn't make a big show of celebration. Instead, he simply smiled and responded as naturally as if Ethan had been talking to him all along. "You had your voice all along, Ethan. I just helped you realize it was safe to use it." Over the next hour, Ethan spoke 12 more words. He told Amy her painting was beautiful. He asked Marcus if he wanted to build blocks together. He said goodbye to each of his friends by name. And as Sarah was gathering their things to leave, he looked up at her with those bright hazel eyes and said the words she had been waiting 5 years to hear. "I love you, Mommy." The drive home was a blur of tears and laughter. Sarah called her mother, her brother, even Marcus at the company to share the incredible news. But most importantly, she and Ethan talked. Really talked. His vocabulary was limited and his voice was soft, but every word felt like a miracle. That evening, as Sarah tucked Ethan into bed, he spoke the longest sentence he had ever uttered. "Mommy, Jake showed me that being different is okay. And you showed me that love doesn't need words." Sarah realized that her son's first words had taught her the most important lesson of her life. Success wasn't measured by quarterly profits or stock prices. True success was measured by human connections, acts of kindness, and the courage to be vulnerable with one another. The next few months brought tremendous changes to their lives. Ethan's speech development accelerated rapidly, as if years of stored words were finally finding their way out. He began attending mainstream classes with speech support, made friends at school, and even joined the art club where his creativity flourished. Sarah restructured her role at the company to maintain better work-life balance, but she also used her resources to establish a foundation supporting inclusive community programs. Maple Grove Community Center received a substantial grant to expand their facilities and hire additional staff. But more importantly, Sarah continued volunteering there, working alongside Jake to create programs that celebrated every child's unique gifts. Jake and Sarah's friendship deepened over shared lunches and long conversations about parenting, resilience, and second chances. He taught her about the dignity of honest work and finding joy in simple moments. She helped him navigate college applications for Lucy and supported his dream of starting a nonprofit organization focused on inclusive playground design. 6 months after Ethan's first words, Sarah stood before a packed auditorium at the National Conference on Inclusive Education. She had been invited to speak about breakthrough moments in special needs parenting, but her message went far beyond disability advocacy. As she looked out at the audience of educators, therapists, and parents, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a successful CEO who thought money and expertise could solve any problem. But it was a blue-collar single father with paint under his fingernails who had taught her the most valuable lesson of her life. The most profound breakthroughs happen not when we try to fix people, but when we accept them exactly as they are. My son didn't need to be cured of his silence. He needed to feel safe enough to speak. And sometimes, the greatest gift we can give someone is simply believing in their worth before they find their voice. As Sarah concluded her speech, she noticed Jake sitting in the audience with Lucy and Ethan beside him. Her son caught her eye and mouthed the words, "I'm proud of you, Mommy." In that moment, Sarah understood that her greatest achievement would never be measured in dollars or recognition, but in the love and connection she had built with the people who mattered most. The story of Ethan's first words spread far beyond that conference. It became a reminder that miracles often come disguised as ordinary kindness, that the most important conversations happen heart to heart rather than voice to voice, and that sometimes the greatest teachers come in the most unexpected packages. Sarah's life had been forever changed by a single father who saw potential where others saw limitations, who created space for belonging where others built barriers, and who understood that every child's voice matters, even when it takes years to find the courage to use it. If this story has touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that kindness can change everything. Subscribe to Pure Kindness Stories for more inspiring tales that celebrate the extraordinary power of human compassion. And remember, in a world that often feels divided, we all have the power to be someone's Jake Morrison, creating safe spaces where others can find their voice and discover their worth. Together, we can build communities where every person feels seen, valued, and loved exactly as they are.